In this episode, we will see client and server components. First of all, we will look at CSR and SSR, that is client side rendering and server side rendering, their differences. Then we will look at hydration. After that, we will see what are the limitations of SSR, server side rendering. Then we will look at the client components. After that, we will look at server components. And then finally, we will see when to use client and server components. In case of React, what happens is that you get an empty page from the server. So you get a HTML page, there is head, there is a body, but inside body there is nothing. There is just one element with ID root. And then React is gonna execute the JavaScript on the client side, and then HTML will be generated, and then that HTML will be inserted into that particular root tag. But in case of Nextjs, what happens is that the components are rendered on the server, the HTML is generated on the server, everything is ready, and that HTML is sent to the client. Once the client browser gets that HTML, so in the body itself there is everything is there, like data, div, whatever tags are there, everything is there in the body. In Next.js, any page is rendered twice. First time it renders on the server, and second time it renders on the client side. Now, reason why we need the second time rendering is because in the first rendering that is happening on the server can't access the browser API, so it can't attach the event listeners to elements. And that is the reason why we need a second time rendering on the client side. When the client receives HTML and JavaScript, it renders the page once again. And then SSR output and CSR output is compared. If the output is same, then hydration happens. So basically in the hydration, what happens is that event listeners are attached to the elements. And at that point of time, page becomes interactive. So this process where event listeners are attached to the HTML elements and when the page becomes interactive is called as hydration. Before Next.js 13, all the components that we were using were client components. But there are two limitations to the client components. First one is double rendering of the components, and a second one is that no direct access to server infrastructure. Even though the client components are pre-rendered on the server, they have to be re-rendered on the client side as well. So the JavaScript required to render those components had to be sent to the client anyways. So the bundle size of the JavaScript is not reduced. So that is one thing. Other thing is that even though user feels that the page has loaded faster, it is not interactive until and unless the hydration has happened. Also, the client components do not have direct access to the server infrastructure. That means they can't directly access the database on the server. To overcome these limitations, server components were introduced in Next.js 13. In Next.js 13, they introduced server components. Two important things to note about server components are that by default, whatever component you are going to create in app router are server components. If you want to specifically create the client component, then you will have to use client directive at the top of the component. Next thing that you need to know is that server components are always rendered only once, and that is on the server. They are not rendered on the client at all because we don't need rendering on the client. Server components do not have any client side state. Three major benefits that we get by using the server components are we get the smaller bundle size. Since the server components are rendered only on the server side, the JavaScript that is required to render those components is kept on the server only. It is not sent to the client side. The next benefit that we get out of the server components is that we have direct access to the server infrastructure. That means we can make direct database calls and API calls as well. And finally, we also get the benefit of component streaming. Server components support a concept called as component streaming, where components can start rendering on the server and progressively stream content to the client as it becomes available. This can significantly reduce the time to first byte and provide a faster initial loading experience for users. Now that we have two kinds of components, client component and the server component, how do you decide like which component to use? So it's very simple. If you want to handle any kind of JavaScript events, if you want to access any browser API, for example, local storage, session storage, those kind of things, or if you want to use use effect, use state, these kinds of hooks, then you don't have choice. You have to use client component in that case. But if you want to make a database call or API call, then it is recommended to use server components.